Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. Let us know where you think we got it right and where you think we completely missed the point, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com or Rumble, Facebook, or other social channels. So let's get into it. Brian, you look kind of unhinged today, brother. What's going on?
Well, I think we should talk about, if we're gonna chronicle what this moment is in time is like, I think we have to just talk about how things that you and I took for granted are completely different now. And I'm going to share a clip with you. It's a very short one, so this won't take long. But it's I believe this is an attorney general. So let's see here. Let's just hear what he has to say. I'm pretty sure he's an attorney general from like Minnesota. I'll correct that when he's done. But let's listen to what he says about who's at fault for the uptick in car thefts.
All right.
We've also got to go upstream. We've got to make sure that the automobiles are not so easy to steal so that they're a tempting, attractive nuisance for young people. And, right now we are investigating two major automakers because their cars are dramatically too easy to steal for young people.
All right. So we've apparently decided that it's the fault of the car manufacturers that there is car theft or quote unquote too much car theft. And, I'm thinking back like when I was, let's say, of the age where, young men do this kind of stuff. So let's say between 16 and 24, I'm going to guess that a high percentage of auto thefts are done by people in that cohort.
Probably so.
So back when I was that age, there would have been no shortage of cars built in the 80s, maybe even 70s. Like I have a 71 C10 pickup that, if you went in, like there's locks in the doors, but I'm not sure how much effort it would take, to get into that. It seems like things were easier to steal then than they are now.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna go way out on a limb here without any FBI data in front of me and suspect that more car thefts happen today than happened in 1994 or 1992 when I was of the age where that kind of thing would have happened. And so this is a great illustration, I think, of where we are so hard trying to avoid the obvious and put the blame anywhere except for where it probably belongs. So to the point that we're now going to sue car manufacturers. So he's talking about car manufacturers making it quote unquote too easy for cars to be stolen. But also in LA, they were trying to go after, and I'm not sure if they actually did or not, but I think it was Hyundai or Kia or both.
Yeah.
That they were making the catalytic converters too easy to steal. And so we're like doing mental backflips here to avoid any requirement to face the obvious in order to go after new villains and culprits for things as society kind of devolves in this area. I think this is like just wild.
Yeah.
It's hard to even explain to somebody 50 or 60 years from now what a massive change this is.
Well, it's incredible because I can think of example after example of the same thing. So in Washington State, you are currently, fortunately, far away from Washington State, so you are not as in danger of having your car stolen.
I fled the People's Republic of Washington.
Well, and so while we're recording this podcast, there is a good chance that my car will be stolen. It's just sitting outside the office here.
Yeah.
And really, the obvious reason is because in Washington State, we don't prosecute car theft. It is de facto legal. And to therefore say that it is the manufacturer's responsibility to prevent that I don't necessarily have a word for that. Let me give you another example of that same.
Is that word okay?
I'll go with that. I'll go with stupid. One of my businesses involves U-Haul, and we have had regularly people that have either broken into the U-Hauls or actually stolen the U-Hauls right from our lot. Now, it turns out that as a smart businessman, I have the license plates and I know what those U-Hauls look like.
Yeah.
Strange. I'm ahead of the curve in that regard. However, if I call the police and I tell them that here's the license plate, here's what it looks like, here's the mileage, here's everything, and here's when it was stolen, and they see it driving down the road, they are not able to pick it up because they didn't see it happening, because our legislature is so wonderful. So yes, it's a complete reversal of logic, of sanity, of anything, reasonable. And it all seems to fall into this narrative we've talked about before of blaming the wrong person. So, another example we have in our state here is there's a goal to reduce the number of people in prison, right? And it's a worthwhile goal, right? I'd say that's a worthwhile goal. Now, there's two ways you can do that. Make sure that people don't commit crimes therefore they don't want to go to prison. Or you could, I suppose, just go throw open the doors of the prison, not put anybody in there. If somebody steals a car, steals, anything or hurts somebody, say, well, we're not going to send them to prison. We'll just, let them out on their own recognizance.
Yeah.
We've decided the latter is the better choice. So again, it falls in that same word you were talking about.
We have a definite pattern of, we want an outcome. We want more children of color to pass tests. We want more people out of prison. And as you said, there's two ways to do that. You can change behaviors, or you can change standards.
Yes.
For decades, we were trying to change behaviors. Like, hey, if you want to get better grades, let's institute better study habits. Parents, let's keep our kids engaged, like that kind of stuff. That didn't get the outcome we wanted. So now we're just changing the standards. And if you check X boxes on your melanin content or whatever, you either have no standards or reduced standards, or we just got rid of all standards. I think it was, speaking of Washington, I think I heard last week that the city of Seattle was getting rid of all their, what we used to call advanced course,
advanced placement courses,
gifted courses or whatever. So that's gone now. We're changing the standards rather than changing behaviors. And on the front of the car theft being now blamed on the car manufacturers, all we've done is shift responsibility from who should stop car theft from the perpetrator to the manufacturers of the cars. So let's play this out, Dave. And again, I'm going to be a little bit sarcastic because I really do think this is stupid. But also, okay, if we're missing an obvious thing here, let's suss that out too. But let's fast forward a world where now perpetrators don't have responsibility to not do bad things. The car manufacturers do, for example. What is that world going to look like in 10 years if that snowball starts getting momentum? And now, rapists really shouldn't have that responsibility either. Who's gonna have the blame? You can't have bystanders do it, because the guy at the subway was he's on trial for manslaughter or murder or whatever it is in New York. So bystanders can't jump in and do anything. As you mentioned, the police won't do anything if they don't see it. So is the dress that's sold at Walmart, is the manufacturer of that going to be responsible to prohibit rapes? How does this work in other things?
Well, so here's the lens you have to look at it through. So there is a logic to it. It's a stupid logic, but there is a logic to it. So here's the logic to it. The logic is that if anything bad happens, and we've had some discussion about this before, if anything bad happens, it is the fault of the person who has the most power and the most money. It is not the fault of the person that has the least power and the least money. So therefore, if cars are stolen, well, it must be those rich, evil, capitalist car manufacturers, not the poor people, the folks that are oppressed. It's the oppressor oppressed
Yep.
matrix again.
Okay.
So
All right.
so everything. So you can take anything you're talking about, anything that we've discussed. You can take a look at it from the standpoint of banks. We've had, and in fact, this predates some of what we're talking about before. The fault of people who took out loans they couldn't afford and therefore lost their house was not on the people who took out the loan, but it was on the banks that were evil
Right.
because they're the big moneyed
They
interests.
should have known
So
better than to lend those people.
they, or well, of course, you can't say that either because now
No. Well, you could have back then in 2007. You'd be hard pressed to be able to say that now for sure.
yeah, you might have said that back then, and some people did, and they didn't
Yeah.
actually end up canceled.
I specifically recall, like in the throes of the great financial recession or great financial crisis in circa 2010, where it was common on the news for the people to say the bank should have known better than to lend those people
Right,
money who couldn't
right.
afford it. No way in hell you could say that today.
No,
Absolutely no way
no,
you could say that.
no. Well, and the same thing's true. Let's take, you mentioned like AP courses and such, right? So we've got there's students in school that don't perform very well, and whose fault is it that they don't perform very well? Is it is it the culture? Is it the student? Is it the parents? Or is it rather a history of colonialism that has oppressed people for hundreds or thousands of years? Well, okay, the colonial powers, those are the rich powers. So it must be the default. And see, this is where there is some consistency here. The consistency is it doesn't matter who did the deed. That's irrelevant. Who did the deed just means that you're hyper focused on your privilege, right? It doesn't matter who did the deed. What matters is who has the power and who doesn't have the power, who is oppressed and who's the oppressor.
Yeah.
That's the matrix.
It's what seems to me is this is we're doing like severe, high quality, Olympic style gymnastics to avoid mental gymnastics to avoid having the real conversation,
Right.
which in some of these cases will lead us to asking questions like, why do 17-year-old young men or 22-year-old young men have a higher tendency now to commit these kinds of crimes than they did back in, let's say, 1982 or 1992 or 2002? We don't ask those questions because the answer might be, like, I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying it might be that the number of fathers in homes has dropped dramatically, and there might be some causation there, not correlation, might actually be some causation tied to that.
Yeah.
And the risk of that being identified would just be that's way too high, because that would go counter to the story. What's the I heard a version of it of a couple years ago. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle is one of the ways I heard it said. In that we don't need dads, we don't need men, we don't need those kinds of people,
Right.
and if they're not around, it's just as good. And I would argue, having been a young man, that's probably not the case.
No.
We might find that there's some benefits to having father-like figures around in young men's life that might keep them from joining gangs,
Right.
or might keep them from doing otherwise atrocious behavior regardless of where they live.
And the reality is it's so bad that, I mean, you can't ask some of these. You're asking some cultural questions.
Right.
You're asking some real insightful and incisive cultural questions. Now, typically speaking, the folks that study things like that, sociologists and academics and this type of thing, would look at that and say, "Oh, well, this is an interesting question. Let's study this." However, part of the thing we've seen in just recent years is, even in the halls of academia, or maybe I shouldn't say even, but in the halls of academia, there are certain topics that you are just not allowed to talk about, to study, because you might reached the wrong conclusion. Now, this is a completely anti-intellectual, anti-science approach to the acquisition of knowledge. Typically, the acquisition of knowledge, and this has changed in our lifetime, the acquisition of knowledge for most of our lives has been this idea of, well, here's a question. Let's go see what the data tells us objectively. And then once we know that, maybe we can debate what we're going to do about that or how we're going to make some changes to improve this.
I've never heard you sound like such a colonialist as just now. Like, I mean,
That's right. I'm an oppressor.
I mean, that's just off the charts, like a great demonstration of what a rube you are.
That's right. That's right. It comes from that
Your
Greek
privilege is
Christian thing.
screaming right now, Dave.
Yeah. Well, and that's really where the narrative, we've talked about this before as well. We've talked about everything before. The narrative drives even what facts can be considered, what questions can be asked, and therefore the conclusion that's reached as a result of that is always going to be suspect. Now, as we've alluded to in the past, reality always wins. So a counter example of this has been in the state of Oregon recently. And for Kenny G, you can look this up. There's some good historical examples of the facts we're talking about here. In the state of Oregon, they not too long ago decided that hard drugs were not going to be prosecuted. They're going to be de facto legalized.
Heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, the whole mix.
The whole shooting match was going to be legalized. They were not going to arrest people for that anymore.
It's 2024 now. That happened around 2019, 2020,
I think it was,
somewhere in there.
I think it was in the early 2020s. In the early 2020s, and it really reached its fruition just 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, predictably, there was a dramatic uptick in the amount of people dying and, hurting themselves because of hard drugs. The theory behind it was that the people that are using these drugs are the less fortunate, shall we say, of society, which is true. They're disproportionately black and brown, which is true. That's all true. There's nothing false about that. But therefore, because these people fall into that oppressed category, we shouldn't be prosecuting them with police power. We should be offering them the ability to go through rehabilitation, which virtually nobody did. But now,
I think they had to sign something. If I remember right, they had to sign something that said they would go to rehab or pay a $50 fine or something like that. It was,
it didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work.
What do you know? It didn't work.
And by the way, like I agree with you that this is something not hard to see coming. And simultaneously, this is one of the things I love about our country is that a state like Oregon could try this thing. And who knows, maybe you and I are full of crap and maybe it really would have worked. And how awesome would it have been to find some kind of antidote for this plague that is coming upon our society. And if they did stumble upon something that was out of the box that you and I wouldn't have been able to ever wrap our heads around until having seen it work, that would have been awesome. That's not how it played out, and they're going to have to unwind it. And I appreciate that, just like I appreciate when it happened in Kansas, and they took on a monetary or fiscal policy that was very conservative, and they took it too far. And 3 years later, 4 years later, they had to completely unwind that.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that the state of Kansas took on this very conservative approach to things that was proven not to work. And that's part of the beauty of our country is that states can try things like that, and we learn what works and doesn't work collectively.
Yeah, that's in fact that's the original intent of the formation of a union of states. I mean, so a lot of times folks think of us as a singular country, as a solitary country. We are a union of different states. And what do they call the states? The sort of the petri dish of democracy, where Florida can try one thing, California can try another thing, New York can try another thing, and then we figure out what works and what doesn't work, and we make.
But in this case, Oregon tried something that, again, I would argue that most sane people would have said, that's probably not going to work. And what do you know?
It didn't.
It got worse, and telling people they could do whatever drugs they wanted, in fact, allowed or maybe even enticed more people to do things that harmed themselves and others, and destroyed probably more families, more lives. There was more homelessness. There was more crime. There was more disease on the streets. There's more people who couldn't take their kids to parks. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that happened as a negative consequence.
But here's the problem. Here's the problem. The We learned that methodology for combating drug addiction and crime and all that, we learned it didn't work, and so they reversed it. But what they haven't done is they haven't identified the root cause, that is their narrative, that doesn't work. That their narrative was false to
Right.
begin with, and that narrative being that the oppressor oppressed dichotomy has to trump all physical and experiential reality.
Yeah.
So until the problem is that they're going to go down some other similar road, other states are going to keep going down similar roads of trying things that are obvious on the surface of it to those that kind of have a connection to reality. Um, uh, they're going to find out that they don't work, and then they'll backtrack and they'll reverse them. But until we have a society, a culture that says, "Look, Brian, if you do certain bad things, then you're going to reap the rewards for those certain bad things. If you take out, or if you do certain good things, you're going to
Yeah.
still have to pay the consequence. If
That
you take
that
out a
reeks
student
of
loan,
personal responsibility, and I just don't think we're ready for that, Dave.
no, we're not ready for that. So if you take out a student loan, then you don't have to pay that back.
No. Well, I mean, you may have to pay a student loan back. Like if you went to a trade school or you went to
Sure.
a truck driving school, you might have to pay a student loan back, just not yours.
Well, yeah. I mean, you don't have to pay back the one that the in
Yeah.
power voting bloc, or
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
in power politician who wants your vote will pay you to
Right.
not
Right.
pay
Right.
back. So that's,
Yeah.
so there's that. But until the narrative changes, until the societal philosophy changes, that individuals, despite the fact, now, to say this is not to say that there are not cultural or historical disadvantages that groups of people or individuals have had. So
Yeah.
the thing we have to come to realize at some point, so that we're not unhinged, is we're going to have to come to the point of saying that, yes, these things are true. These disadvantages you've experienced are true. And everybody has, to one degree or another, disadvantages and advantages, privileges and disadvantages. It's part of
Yep.
being human beings. Um,
Yep.
until we come to the point where we say, this is true, but you are still responsible for your behaviors. You're still responsible for your choices in life, and you're going to bear some consequences or benefits of those things. So the flip side of this is also there. The flip side being that if you are deemed as privileged, then those privileges that you have, maybe that you worked really hard for, a high income, a retirement savings, etc., those are also under attack, so that you may not have the benefit of utilizing all that you've worked for to benefit somebody else.
Yeah.
So
Well, this was a TV show. This was not reality, but a very popular TV show. And Kenny G will have to ask Chat GPT 48,000 what a TV show is, but a very popular TV show called Law and Order SVU Special Victims Unit, I think was the version that did this a few weeks ago or a couple months ago. They did a storyline, and that show centers a lot on sexual assault cases and things like that. It's based in New York City, and the storyline was such that a woman was raped, a white woman, I think, was raped by a young man who was a person of color, and the storyline evolved so that the white woman would not press charges because she felt so strongly that this young man had been unfairly, given an unfair shot at life because he was not a privileged group, and that society was to blame for what happened, and he would be treated poorly if he was to face consequences. And my point with that is, like, this is a major TV show where that's
yeah,
now an acceptable storyline, which again, 20 years ago,
yeah,
there's
no
no
way.
way that person would have been like put in an insane asylum and said,
Right.
like, you can't, you're not even trying to protect yourself. Like, you need to be put away where you can't hurt yourself. So the all these things are indications that these things, are values on relating to, who's at fault for things. Again, personal responsibility completely different than it was 15 years ago, for sure. But to the point now where we're like actually the government is like suing car manufacturers for making it quote unquote too easy to steal cars. all to avoid these conversations, which might lead us to acknowledge that while race should never be a factor
Right.
in judging somebody, there are cultures that are more beneficial to the collective than others.
Right.
And that's a distinction that, again, nobody wants to have that conversation. Like, you
No.
cannot have a conversation where, we say, well, why is it that Asian kids do better at tests? Are they born smarter? No, probably not. Do they have a culture that advocates for education and carves out time every day for study and things like that more than other cultures? Yeah. Why
Yeah.
is it that Nigerians come here and do better than good old fashioned uh uh um natural born Americans or whatever? Like, why is it that some groups come here and just
Yeah.
absolutely kick ass?
Yeah.
Some groups are born here and absolutely kick ass, and other groups don't.
Right.
And the answer is, well, they have a culture that requires that.
Right.
And so right now, like this, there's this pro Hamas, pro Palestinian kind of like on college campuses and things like that. In that setting, they're perfectly fine to say, Palestinian is a superior group to the Jews in Israel. That's completely okay. But if you bring that over here and say it in any other context, like,
Right.
I mean, bad things are going to happen to you.
Right. Well, and I think there's two pieces of that. One of them is uber simplistic thinking that says that as you said, outcome is the only thing that matters, and we can't put any more responsibility on those that might have had a bad shake in life or something in life, or historically disadvantaged, et cetera. So there's bad thinking. Then there's the kind of dark side of that as well, and that is that those who recognize that cultural narrative can be manipulated to
Right.
gain themselves power and position and money are doing so, and are the irony of the whole thing is that they're using the people that they are saying that they are wanting to support, who are historically disadvantaged, for their own benefit. They're doing exactly the same thing that they accuse the quote unquote colonizers of doing. So and that is, and it's not unknown to them. I'm sure they know they're doing that. So it's really an evil way of manipulating people and manipulating society.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the irony of it is, if you're completely anti Jim Crow, which I am,
Yeah.
and you look back at 1942 Mississippi, I'm gonna guess they let off young white men of some crimes they wouldn't let off young black men.
Right.
And many of us, including me, would say that's BS. It shouldn't be like
Exactly.
that.
Yep.
So it's the exact same behavior happening today. They've just picked new villains and new heroes and new
Right.
scapegoats, as we've mentioned on here before in this podcast. That like you just said, the behaviors are nothing new. All that's different is we pick different targets.
Right.
And simultaneously we tell ourselves that we've evolved and like we're so much better. Well, the Rwanda stuff happened in like 1995 or 1998 or something like that, where a guy on a radio station was able to convince half the country to go kill the other half the country just because he had a radio show or a radio station. And they were butchering each other with machetes, for crying out loud. Like,
Right.
we've not
Brutal.
evolved all that much. We're still the
No.
same simple brains that we were 300, 400, or 500 years ago. And it's just fascinating to me that as these lessons have been learned over time, how quickly they've been kind of unlearned, and other things have such a higher priority now. Like, again, having the right outcome, having the right story, having the right self-righteousness, having the right ability to convince yourself that you're on the quote unquote right side of history for having this new way of thinking, that you should sue Hyundai for having catalytic converters that are too quote unquote easy to steal, versus telling the 18-year-old kid, hey, how about you don't do this? And if you do, we're going to put you in jail. Or how about we figure out why this is happening with this cohort of young men, and I don't know, maybe try to put some things in place that would prevent that. Like, I don't know, maybe stopping divorces. and maybe promoting the idea of getting married before you have children, and all the things that Harvard said not that many years ago about how to avoid poverty, which was graduate high school, get married before you have kids, and get a job.
Right.
If you did those three things, I think
Pretty
those are the
simple.
three things. You had like an 87% chance of not being in poverty. That is completely out the window now. And now, we've got a new set of rules that we just have to follow the anti-colonial thing, and whatever carnage there is along the way is okay.
And speaking of carnage, where does this lead? So, interestingly, there's a new show. I believe it was written by somebody from China. It's called Three Body Problem, and it's a sci-fi show. It's on Netflix, and one of the first entry in the show in the US version, it wasn't this way in China because it wouldn't have passed the censors, but in the US version, the start of the show was 1966, and when the Maoist revolution was happening, and a young child essentially confronting a professor in front of a big crowd, obviously all wearing the Mao hats and such, and the child was essentially telling the professor, well, you claim that the theory of relativity is true. That's a capitalist, Einstein, and so he complaining about that, and also saying that, well, and you taught in your class the Big Bang Theory, which means that it is that there was a beginning and that leaves space for God, which is anti-revolutionary. So you have to recant this. And then they beat him to death, and which is not, even though that particular iteration is fictional, a lot of that happened in the Maoist revolution. The kids, anything that took apart the narrative, whether it was factual science or whether it's just common sense things like you and I are talking about, was deemed punishable by death. So while people might think that as we complain about these things, we talk about, the ridiculousness and silliness of all this stuff, well, yeah, whatever, just get over it and mind your own business. There are definite consequences that are potentially life and death consequences to this philosophy having its full flowering in any society. We've seen it over and over. We saw it in Russia. We saw it in China. We've seen it across the globe and across the millennia. So this is one of the reasons that it's important for us now and for Kitty G in the future to have a firm grounding in reality and a grounding in a societal philosophy that actually comports with how reality really works and how human beings really work. If not, the consequences, well, I mean, in Maoist China, something like 60 million people were killed as a result of a bad philosophy.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a saying that I generally tend to believe, which is how you do anything is how you do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that 100% applies to the government. So the same people who are wanting to sue the car manufacturers, again, the first example I gave at the opening of this podcast episode was who's responsible for the rape of the woman walking down the street? Is it the clothing manufacturer? Because you can't have a situation where bystanders get involved. That's been, we're loud and clear. The message is you do not get involved unless you're willing to go to prison for manslaughter or second degree murder or whatever. That's loud and clear. Also, the police are saying if they didn't see it, it didn't happen. Also, if they catch the person who did it, the person is let out of prison pretty quickly with no bail in many cases. So we don't have a deterrent. We don't have the ability for police to stop it. We don't have the ability for other public people to stop it. So who's going to protect the woman from the rape? Well, based on how this other stuff is going, then we would just say, well, listen, I'm sorry, she happened to be the wrong race, and her race has like brought this kind of stuff upon her. So it's not the perpetrator's fault. It's her colonial ancestors. They're the ones that fall the blame, the finger at them. And basically she's just shit out of luck. Like she just shouldn't have been walking down that street, which again is not that much different than what they would have said in 1942 Mississippi if a black girl got raped by a white man. And it was disgusting then, and it's just as disgusting now. But as we've mentioned before, we have a new class of people who believe that they're so righteous that they can't see that the similarities in that behavior, which is wild to me. Like, that's the part that blows me away, is how largely educated people, far more educated than me, can't see how they're doing exactly the same behaviors as or looked so poorly upon from 80 years ago. It's crazy.
Well, and it seems to me that this comes down to this notion of identitarianism. In other words, when we vest all of our sort of moral thinking not in a philosophical standard, in standards of behavior, regardless of the identity of the person, but when we vest all of our standards of treatment based on the identity of the person themselves.
Right.
So when you remove, because all human beings have, all we really have is what we do, right? I mean, we've got what we think, but in terms of my relationship with you, for instance, it's really all about what we do, how we interact together, how we
Right.
talk, how we behave. So in terms of how we run a society, that's really the only way to do it. But we've divorced the notion of behaviors as the primary motivation and judgment for how we run our society, and made it all about the identity of the individual, the historic identity of the individual, and not even, and to your point, not even the identity of the individual, but the group to which the individual belongs. I mean,
Right.
so
Which,
at the end of the day,
again, if you would have told me in 1993 when I graduated from high school that this is what it would be like, 30
yeah,
years hence, I would have said, "There's no way. There's no way we're
yeah,
going to regress like that. There's no way we're going to in 30
we're
years
more
we're going to
enlightened.
regress 70 years. There's no way it's going to be like that."
Yeah, yeah.
Here we are.
But here we
Here
are,
we-
and it's a recurring theme. I mean, it's a recurring theme in it's a recurring theme across the world. So it's not just the United States. So let's talk about the Middle East right now. So that
Yeah.
recurring theme is at play exactly in the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So in that conflict, the Israelis are the powerful people. There's no
Right.
question. They are the people with the ultimate power. I mean, they got nukes, right?
Yeah.
The Palestinians don't. So they are the people without power. And now, if we would take, I'm fond of saying that you can take that situation, overlay that situation on World War II, and say, how is this any different, or how would it be different than how should the Allies have stopped short of Berlin, short of stopping Hitler? Should the Allies have said, "No, we're going to call ceasefire, we're going to drop in some food, call it all good"? And lest anybody misunderstand me, I'm not for starving anybody. I don't want to starve the Palestinians or anybody else. But should that campaign have stopped? Well, if you say that in many circles today regarding that conflict there, what you'll hear is, yeah, but Hitler had power and the Palestinians really don't have power, regardless of what they did, regardless of October 7th, regardless of 93% of the Palestinian population believing that October 7th was either justified or didn't happen. Regardless of all that, they're still the victim in this situation because the Israelis are the people with power. And so
Yeah,
unless that
I'm gonna guess
changes,
that the way a person would answer that question of should the Allies have stopped short in 1945, I'm gonna guess the person who was an occupant, not a guard, an occupant of Auschwitz would have a much different answer than a citizen of Iran.
yes, yeah,
I'm just gonna go out on a limb and guess that they have different answers, which and I'm grateful that we didn't have different answers. That we
yeah,
said, who cares what their religion is, and who
right,
cares what their ethnic background is?
right,
These people are being put in ovens for crying out loud. Like
yeah, they're
that's
monsters.
and you could argue that of all. I'm not saying this is for sure true. I'm saying you could make a pretty compelling argument that over the last several thousands of years, no group has been hurt more, harassed more, genocided more than Jews.
Yeah. Oh,
Like
yeah. If they've had a
you can
bad,
make a pretty compelling case that like they're near, if not at the top of the list, they're pretty close to it.
yeah,
And so this idea that now they're the powerful ones, so that like bad things okay to happen to them. When just 80 years ago, just 85 years ago,
yeah,
they had no power to the point where they were sacrificing every belonging on the way to get on a train to go to Auschwitz. Like
yeah,
it's lunacy, Dave. It's
yeah,
like it's absolute. Like again, that's the part that it's the part that's hardest for me to wrap my head around, hardest for me to articulate to a Kenny G, hardest for me to believe like this is not some just weird dream.
Yeah.
It's absolute lunacy that people could go backwards in morality like that.
Well, and I think we have to look at this point in history and throughout history, and as we see this occurring over and over again, and it'll probably occur in Kenny G's time too. And we have to say, what is the lesson that we can learn from this about what unchangeable humanity is about, what unchangeable human nature is about? Now, I shouldn't say unchangeable. I'll say steady, because not everybody
Yeah.
believes in this, but there is, throughout all of recorded history, there are these dynamics of groups that we belong to that think that other groups are inferior to them, whether it's Vikings versus English or whoever. It doesn't even matter who it
Yeah.
is. But so this is a recurring theme, and so what we have to do is we have to, if I'm going to communicate anything to Kenny G in the future, it would be, remember that humanity has, as part of our DNA, really, I mean it very literally. I mean, I think it's very true. Part of our DNA is to think that our group, however you define that group, maybe it's bald guys over 50. Well, you're not over 50 yet, but pretty soon. Bald,
No.
bald
I'm
guys
still
over
my
50.
mid to late 40s.
Mid to late 40s. Okay, that's good. Bald delusional guys in their mid to late 40s. Okay, so
That's
there we go.
right. That's right.
So maybe it's people like that, or maybe it's whatever race you're a part of. Maybe it's oftentimes it's been whatever country you're from, whatever culture you're
Yeah.
from,
Your
whatever language you speak,
occupation, yeah, all kind
and
education
today
level,
whatever
all kinds of
whatever
things.
sexual orientation you are, or whatever.
Yep.
You have to think that is the primary thing that defines me as a human being, and that's common to human nature. Now, if we are to be enlightened people, you said, well, why are we here again? How could we not, why could we not get past this in the past 70 years? Well, I mean, we haven't gotten past it in 10,000 years, maybe the next 10,000, I don't know. But
Yeah.
one of the things we have to do is we do have to stretch beyond ourselves and think, I am not what my body is. I am not what my skin color is. I'm not where I come from. I mean, those are important parts of me, but that's not who I am. Who I am is what I think, what I believe, what I communicate, what I contribute. If we decide, and let's take Martin Luther King Jr. I want a society where my children are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. If we define a human being in a
You're a
different way,
racist. You just pointed out what a racist you are.
yeah,
Nice going.
I know. Clearly, I'm not down for the struggle. So, but if we decide, if we have to change the definition of what a human being is. A human
Yeah.
being is a person that contributes to the world, to other human beings, and contributes their intellect, their talents, their insight, and the rest of it is just whatever. It's just whatever. This is We need a new definition of what it means to be a human being. And until we have that new definition of what it means to be a human being, culture is going to do this over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think there's so many parallels to just like again the last two big nasty gnarly dynasties, that were at the World War. Let's skip China's revolution and all that kind of stuff. Let's just look at Germany in World War II
Yep.
and Japan in World War II.
Yep.
Right. Germany prior to World War II had no power. They had gotten their asses kicked in a
Yep.
lot of ways, and they were like
World War
down and out. And that was the fuel for them to then, bring in the Nazis and like it. That was the fuel of that misery.
Yeah.
Was what provided the route and the path for Hitler to come to power and do horrible things to other groups of people because it was justified because of the atrocities that had happened to them, their perceived wrongs that had been done to them. Okay.
Right.
And they get so powerful, it takes the entire world to come shut them down. Like the military machine that was Germany was just like something the world had never seen before.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And then let's look at Japan. Well, Japan had a similar story. They had gotten their asses kicked by China. And I think Korea, and my history is a little more fuzzy on that stuff, but for sure China had caused some problems for them. And they had their power taken away, they thought. And so that was justification for them to do what they did. And they became, the second biggest world power
Yeah.
in World War II. And then the entire world had to go shut them down.
Yeah.
And so now the Jews, who at the end of World War II had no power, like arguably the least amount of power of any group in the
Oh,
entire
yeah.
world in
Yes.
1944,
Yep.
right? Now they're perceived as being the ones who have the power, who must be brought down.
Yeah. Well,
And it's like the circle of life on this stuff, which again goes back to the point you and I have made before. There's only two stories to the human condition. One is we were born superior to you because our creator made us better than you, or this other one is you did such horrible things to us that whatever we do is justified. It's the same story over and over again, and it's no different for the people who now the Harvard and Yale educated people who are trying to sue the car manufacturers to right wrongs. It's no different. It's the same belief. Like
yeah.
our people need to be put at the top of the food chain, and whoever we get a crush on along the way is the way it's going to be.
And both of those things, the two things you mentioned, always go together. So, in other words, in World War II, let's take Germany and Japan. In World War II, yes, Germany was crushed unfairly. Wilson was a moron in World War I. All that stuff unfairly punished. There's supposed to be no war guilt to Germany after they lost the war. They understood that, etc. And so they had a grievance because they were treated unfairly. So there was that.
Yep.
But then what went with it? What went with it was the Nietzschean philosophy of the Übermensch, the Superman. So you have both simultaneously. You have both. We feel oppressed and we feel bad, and we're better than everybody else. We're going to establish a 1,000-year Reich of Übermensch, of Superman, and of the Aryan race of blonde-haired, blue-eyed people and such. So there was that.
Yeah.
On the Japanese side, you have the same thing. You've got a grievance society. They had the wars with China, etc. And you had this idea that Hirohito, the emperor of China, was a god. And
God,
therefore,
yeah.
he was a literal god. And so therefore they were absolutely righteous in doing whatever they're going to do to right the wrongs that have been done to them and to support their superior position, because they, after all, are under Hirohito, the god emperor of Japan. And the same thing's true today. I mean, if you look at the radical Islamic position, this notion of there's going to be a global caliphate, the 12th Imam will come, and we are righteous, and so whatever we do, it doesn't matter if we're raping people and cutting children's heads off. That really doesn't matter. I mean, you look at those images and you hear those things that happened on October 7th. You think, how could a human being do this? Well, they do it because they believe, one, they've been oppressed, and two, they are truly righteous in Allah's eyes. They're truly righteous, and therefore anything they do is justified. That happens over. And so those two you mentioned always go together every time.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same thing if you look at the Russian Revolution in 1917 and you look at Mao's China. In Mao's China, they were revolting against the bourgeois rich people who had always held the working people down and whatever. And again, they had to pay, and whatever had to be done, the 60 million people that had to die, well, sucks to be them. That's what it took to get our people in power, and our people had no voice and no power. And whoever we had to crush along the way to change that is what we did, and they did. And if you look at what the Bolsheviks did in Russia, Tsar Nicholas was seen as a demigod, a like part man, part god, and who they had this God had bestowed this power within him and whatever. And they were, had the working people then, the poor people then had all this list of grievances that the czars were reaching in unbelievable wealth while everyone else was like poor, like couldn't afford potatoes and whatever. And so the rich people had to pay, and whatever had to happen for that tribe to win is what had to happen. And I think it was like 100 million people in Russia that died or whatever. It was, and again, like that's the part that is just baffling to me is it's the same story over and over and over again. And I would argue that some of those people have legitimate complaints.
Sure, of course.
Right? If you're starving and the czar is like, got gold couches he's sleeping on, like I get it, right?
Yeah.
My point is like sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but the behavior is always the same.
Yeah.
But this new group who's suing car manufacturers for making it too easy to steal cars doesn't have the ability to see the similarities, or they just don't care. And I don't know which it is, and I don't know which is worse, and I don't know if it even matters. But it's just it's wild to me that this we are this unhinged in my lifetime. It's just I can't get over it. And I imagine it's no different than what your average person thought who lived in Berlin in 1930 or 1941 or 1939. Like, I can't believe this is happening around here. Like, this is crazy.
Well, you mentioned something I think is important to emphasize, and that is that there always is a legitimate complaint. The Germans had a legitimate complaint after World War I. They had a very, very legitimate complaint. In each of the situations, there's always a legitimate complaint. In fact, and what happens is then whoever ascends to power pins all of their gravitas, if you will, on the legitimate complaint that nobody can really argue with. I mean,
right.
But then they extend it with bad philosophy. And this is why I think it's important that we learn and talk about philosophy, because you have to then be able to have enough discernment to understand where the legitimate complaint ends and where the next atrocity starts. Because it always take Rwanda, take any place, and take when something bad happens. So you can take what's happening in the Middle East, and you can say, well, are there any legitimate complaints on the Palestinians? Sure, there's some legitimate complaints, but how do you resolve these complaints? Or that's where you have to be able to step back from identitarianism, from what group I belong to, and say, these things need to be resolved, and let's work together to resolve them. And I predict that in Kenny G's day, the same dynamic will play out, and that there'll be a few people saying these things, and not enough will, but hopefully they'll listen to the podcast. There'll be a cultural revolution.
Right. Well, they'll be really wise to listen to us for sure.
Yes.
Real quick, I know we're running out of time, but what's fascinating about like the Middle East stuff with Israel and Hamas and like Palestinians and like that's been going on for like centuries.
Yes.
And I have no idea how to know who, again, like you said, when does one atrocity end and the next one begin?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Same with Japan and China. They had been fighting for like 2,000 years. I don't know who started it. It's like the Hatfields and McCoys. Somebody stole a pig first, and then somebody else killed a cow, and then Johnny got shot, and like it just escalated. It feels like the same exact thing for all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Or we have the Germany situation where something pops up, kind of a fluke kind of thing, but the behavior is always the same.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Dave. Well, I think we've solved the world's problems on this one today.
We did. Now, all we got to do is get everybody to share the podcast, and then there will be the age of Aquarius. Well, it will dawn, I promise.
That's right. So don't forget, we do want to hear like where you think we're completely blowing it. And you can do that by going to Rumble. They have a great comment section there. You can go to unsilentpodcast.com. And we want to hear, like, if you think we're misrepresenting things, we'd love to hear where you think we got it wrong. We're trying to explain to Kenny G what this moment in time is like. And Dave and I have our perspective for sure, but we'd love to hear somebody else's. If you think there's a piece we left out or a piece we're getting wrong, we'd love to hear for you to share it so we can explain to Kenny G what this is like for all of us. So,
and we'd also love to hear what you think of Brian's new beard too.
Well, yes, for sure. It's a little less gray than I thought, but again, I'm only in my 40s, so that's
mid to late 40s.
Yeah.
Mid to late 40s.
Right. All right. Well, hey, until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.